Just over 12 years ago, I graduated with a Master of Arts in Counseling. I was unsure at the start if clinical work was really for me, initially turning down an internship before I took back the no and decided to give it a try and see if I could find my way as a therapist. I remember in those first months how fresh and overwhelmed I was with everything, not always knowing which theory I was drawing on or which clinical intervention to use. Very quickly, it was clear to me that there was so much to know and learn, and that it would be impossible to find a perfect way to be with the mess of human stuff that sat across from me every week on the therapy couch. So rather than commit to one modality or model, I committed to showing up, to staying curious, and to growing in the art of being curious and non-judgmental with people. I was convinced that regardless of which intervention I used or didn't use, that undoing aloneness would make a difference. Even if I didn't have a clear path through a problem, I believed that human connection changes things. And 12 years later, I couldn't be more certain of that. We find ourselves here in 2023 in a really interesting cultural time. We have more mobility, more opportunities, and more access to information than we ever have before. And yet, according to a recent US survey, over 60% of adults in the States reported feeling lonely, with a staggering 79% of Gen Z adults, the 18 to 22-year-olds, reporting experiencing feelings of loneliness. We are rich in opportunities, and yet many of us are poor in meaningful connections, a reality which carries not only emotional consequences, but physical ones too. Prolonged social isolation, which refers to a lack of social contacts and having few people to interact with, as well as loneliness, which refers to the experience of feeling alone, no matter how much social contact we might have, are both said to impact the body as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Social isolation and loneliness can lead to an increased risk of heart disease, stroke, greater occurrence of mental health disorders, and it's associated with higher rates of premature death. The physical impacts of loneliness are truly staggering. Fundamentally, we are a social species, and we need each other. We need proximity to other people and a sense of belonging in order to regulate our nervous systems and in order to thrive. In the context of therapy, sometimes in jest, I'll note that adults are just babies in bigger bodies. We need so many of the same things now that we needed at the start, albeit in different ways. This is one of the cases where this really is true. Just as an infant would fail to thrive without human connection and care, it seems that our adult bodies also fail to thrive under these circumstances. In a culture that is really consumed with health and wellness, where there are exercise programs and eating plans available everywhere, it seems pretty wild that we have yet to course correct in terms of adjusting our lives to address the social isolation and loneliness that are running rampant. Interestingly enough, in the last half-decade, as we've begun to understand more fully how our disconnected culture is impacting us in the long term, we've seen a number of countries begin to tackle the issue by appointing ministers of loneliness within their own governments, whose mission it is to alleviate systemic isolation and disconnection, so that society as a whole might bypass the negative outcomes associated with loneliness. We are starting to wake up to the reality that something fundamental needs to shift in terms of how we relate to one another. I think it's been a slow erosion of our social ties as we've moved from being more of a collectivist society to an ever-increasing individualistic one. Our sense of commitment to each other, our interdependence, these have been weakening decade over decade. Factually, we need each other far less than we did a half a century ago, as we've embraced individualistic and capitalist frameworks that allow us to meet our needs with cash, not connection. Years ago, we would have found needs met by practicing interdependence and community care. Where folks used to rely on neighbors to watch our pets while we were on holidays, Now you can find a stranger on Rover and pay them $30 a day to come take care of your furry friend. We can pay for a doula to help us through labor and postpartum, rather than birthing with aunties and grandmas. And if we need an egg for a recipe at 9 p.m., it used to mean a call to a neighbor. But now we can probably drive to the nearest Walmart or Shoppers Drug Mart and pick up a dozen, even using the self-checkout on our way home so we don't need to talk to anybody else. As technology has advanced, we also have access to some measure of connection through a device that we carry with us in our pockets. And we've witnessed the decline of social gathering spaces like community centers or sports facilities, as well as reduced attendance in intergenerational spaces like churches. We have fewer places to gather face-to-face with others and less practical needs to depend on each other for. This has contributed to weakening social ties and less sense of interdependence than ever before. And unfortunately, the pandemic years only further entrenched our isolation as it required physical space from each other for so long. A loneliness epidemic surely seems to make sense when we look at these factors, doesn't it? It's no wonder lots of people aren't thriving relationally when the way that our current culture is organized makes it so hard to nurture and grow connections that are reciprocal and supportive. And now maybe some of you are thinking that it's easy, just put yourself out there, go meet people. I think I've said those things to clients before, just join a club, join a team. This sounds like a really logical solution to aloneness, is to go be with people. But in all reality, it's easier said than done. When we have experienced profound loneliness and social isolation, not only are our long-term health outcomes impacted, but the way that our autonomic nervous system functions is impacted as well. This system is the part of our body that regulates involuntary body functions, like breathing and our heart rate, and it has a lot to do with how safe we feel in the world. The autonomic nervous system coordinates our fight, flight, freeze, and relaxation responses. And what's really noteworthy is that social isolation and loneliness impact this system too. A 2022 New York Times article explains it well when it says, "The human brain, having evolved to seek safety in numbers, registers loneliness as a threat. The centers that monitor for danger, including the amygdala, go into overdrive, triggering a release of fight or flight stress hormones. Subconsciously, you start to view other people more as potential threats, sources of rejection or apathy, and less as friends or remedies for your loneliness. So basically, loneliness triggers a safety response that tells our body other people are sources of threat rather than safety, which can perhaps explain for some of us how hard it may have been to reach out and build connections after the isolation of the pandemic years. Not only does loneliness prime us to see other people as threats, but COVID suggested as much. And now we are faced with restoring social relationships, not as dangerous, but as spaces of safety and support. Even though we know we need other people, some of us may have an internal response that cautions us against moving towards the very thing that we need. And maybe you've noticed this as life has gone back to more of a pre-pandemic rhythm, that maybe it feels a little harder to say yes to social things. Maybe connection leaves you feeling a little more tired and a little less energized than it used to. There seems to be a significant level of effort required to be social that many people hadn't experienced before. And the work of overcoming this can be a barrier to deepening current connections and to building new ones. On a nervous system level, lots of lonely folks might just be stuck in fight, flight, or freeze and have a really hard time moving towards other people to engage. And yet, in what might be a really cruel twist for the lonely folks out there, the very thing that helps us out of those states, at fight, flight, or freeze, into a calmer and more relaxed space in our body, is social relationships. Not any, but safe ones. And it's in connection with humans or even our pets, where we feel free to be ourselves, that we can find grounding and a sense of calm. When we experience social conditions where we can be confident and comfortable, where we're safe to be ourselves, our heart rate and our breathing will slow, our blood pressure drops, and that stress response that has been activated by loneliness will turn off. In the therapy world, we talk about this space as ventral, if you're a Googler and you want to learn more. And it's often a therapy goal to help people grow the skill of moving in and out of this place. Our bodies weren't designed to stay in fight, flight, or freeze for extended periods of time. And so, if social engagement in the form of safe connection is the answer to helping lonely and socially isolated bodies settle, what does this look like for us in adulthood? Friend making, community building, and deepening connections is so different as an adult than it is as a child. I don't know if any of you remember making friends as a kid. For many of us, I think it was pretty easy. You sat beside someone in the library, you were their lab partner in chemistry class, you liked the same music, and all of a sudden you had a friend. Growing up, we had some of the key ingredients for friend making laid out for us, primarily proximity and frequency. I know a lot of friendships build at school or in the neighborhoods that we live in with people we see on the regular. And we also had the opportunity for continuous, unplanned social interactions and the vulnerability of learning together as students. All of these factors, sociologists have concluded, are essential for organic relationship building. But the older we get, the harder it is to find proximity, frequency, unplanned interactions, and shared vulnerability. Some people might experience this in a work setting or in the place where you live if you've got community built in. But as remote work has become more prevalent, and as we look at our devices, rather than each other when in shared public spaces like on the bus or in a lineup, we have a significant lack of opportunity to bump against these essential relationship building components. And so a lot of us are finding ourselves in adulthood learning all over again how to make friends. And it really is no small feat. Friend making and friendship deepening is a task that takes a significant amount of effort. Jeffrey Hall, a researcher from the University of Kansas, found that it takes 50 hours of connecting to turn an acquaintance into a casual friend, 90 hours to deepen into good friend territory, and a whopping 200 hours of connection to build a best friendship. In a world where the answer to how have you been is often busy, it's easy to see that moving from loneliness to connection can be a really difficult task to make happen. And so, on a practical level, what do? I would propose that we rekindle the art of friend making and we engage our creativity when it comes to connecting. I think lots of people have really busy lives and small margins for relationship building, and if we wait for calendars to clear to go for a coffee date, it might be weeks before we see each other. And then let's face it, someone's gonna get sick and we're gonna have to cancel and reschedule for 3 weeks down the road and do it all over again. And so my challenge to you as we move from here, maybe aware in new ways of the reality of loneliness, is that we might consider the following ways to engage differently when it comes to friend making. I challenge you to engage the ordinary, to engage your vulnerability, to engage rhythms, and to open your circles. And I'll explain a little bit. Community building, connecting, and deepening of social relationships doesn't only need to happen in pre-planned events, in dinner dates, or going out, in spite of what our current cultural norms may be. I think that finding ways to engage ordinary rhythms of life together is a way that we start logging those friendship building hours. That might look like inviting someone to run errands together. My dear friend and I meet at Costco. We shop together, we grab a coffee and go our separate ways. It also could look like starting a potluck with neighbors where you bring your own meals and eat them together so that nobody has to go through the work of hosting and making something for everybody. Everybody's eating dinner anyway. It could look like walking over to your neighbor's front porch as you're cruising the neighborhood and stopping in for an impromptu visit, or seeing if they want to walk with you. Or maybe it means eating lunch in the lunchroom with your colleagues rather than alone at your desk. When we combine the ordinary parts of life that we do anyway with connection, we can engage with more spontaneity and ease and do life alongside each other in a way that feels easy and that doesn't require copious amounts of coordination. In addition to being mindful of ordinary moments that could become connected moments, one thing we've noted to be missing quite often these days is interdependence. And so engaging vulnerability becomes a means of deepening social connection and acknowledging the needs and the benefits of support. As someone who moved to Manitoba in my early 20s, I came here without friends. I had a partner and 0 girlfriends to my name. I think back often to how my very first friendship here formed. My now best friend of 17 years, she called me up shortly after we first met on the telephone, because we didn't have cell phones back then, and she asked me to come help paint her kitchen cupboards. She recognized that she had a need, and rather than tackle the job on her own, she invited help and support and an opportunity for us to work together on a task and get to know each other. The conversation was quick. I said, "No, thank you." Precisely because I wasn't feeling settled or safe, and I was convinced that I was bad at painting and she'd probably be disappointed in my efforts. A few minutes later, after my thinking brain came online, I realized that this was one of those things I needed to do, so I called her back. Someone was reaching out, and if I was going to undo my own aloneness, I needed to reach back. And 17 years later, I couldn't be more glad that I did. Engaging vulnerability can look like asking for help on a project, inviting a pal to drive with you while you drive out to the cabin to fix something, or making a request to solve a problem that you could have also outsourced and paid to solve. Somehow it's easier to pay a stranger than ask a friend, and I think that's something we want to be mindful of and work at shifting. We have neighbors in our neighborhood who've become close friends of ours, and we both are one-vehicle families with kids. Our friendship has deepened over the years as we've grown comfortable asking each other for things, like borrowing a van, or a tool, or the garment steamer I have sitting in my room at home right now that belongs to my neighbor. When we engage vulnerability, we are reminding each other that we are allowed to need, that it's okay to seek support, and that we don't have to do it alone. This builds interdependence, and it undoes the individualistic mindset that has contributed to the space growing between us. Another way that we might support growing connections and building relationships is to consider engaging rhythms or building things into the flow of your life. This might look like participating in a choir, organizing a monthly game night or a book club, or having wing night with pals. When we build opportunities for being together into our schedules, we prioritize connection and are less likely to slip into patterns of isolation. Engaging rhythms can also take the pressure off of one person to be the group organizer and can help relationships feel more equitable. And now, one last point I'll suggest in terms of friend making and community building is that of opening your circles, if you have one. I've often heard that Winnipeg can be friendly, but not necessarily welcoming. People are kind and nice, but they don't necessarily go to the work of opening up friend networks to include new people. There can be hesitancy towards changing the status quo, and as such, we end up leaving new folks, perhaps those without circles of their own, on the periphery. We might offer kindness, but never real belonging. This one can be really hard to do, especially when we have long-standing social relationships, and it can be really risky to shift what's been. But I think being horseshoe rather than circle people is one of the ways we do our part in tackling loneliness. Circles are closed. There is no entry point for people on the outside. New people look at a circle and there's no easy way to see how they could belong. And coming towards the circle as somebody on the outside isn't the safe starting point that we need in order to brave undoing isolation. Whereas if we approach a horseshoe, we can sneak in and saddle up at the end and find a place in the conversation, and that might feel a little more doable. At the core, loneliness and social isolation are issues that revolve around disconnection and the lack of safety that results in our bodies. And so I think an antidote then is creating more safety and more connection in the world so that we can have safer and more settled humans in healthier bodies, living in communities that engage and support each other, that depend on each other, and create spaces to meaningfully connect. I think that by engaging the ordinary, engaging vulnerability, engaging rhythms, and opening up our circles, that we can do our part in building more safety for ourselves and others as we work to undo the separateness and isolation so many are experiencing. And while the worldwide ministers have meetings about how to solve the problem of loneliness, I think we have the power to live in ways that create real, meaningful changes in the worlds we live in. Courage to you as you find ways to see and be seen as you go forward from here. And now, please join us in singing our closing hymn, 134 in your gray hymnal, Our World is One World.